What is the cost of lies?
We are going through possibly the worst humanitarian crisis that our generation has witnessed. With the second wave of coronavirus hitting Indian shores hard, things are falling off. Oxygen running out, inadequate hospital beds, emergency medical staff tired to their last bones, failing governance, shortage of vaccines, hesitation in people for getting vaccinated. The challenges we are facing right now is countless. But where did it all start? Was it possible for us to stop it earlier? Did we not learn anything from our past mistakes? To understand this situation, how we got here, and what could have been done differently, I thought of looking at the situation through the lens of Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster that the world never forgot. And the horrors were presented in the crudest form in the 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl, which will help us understand how we are dealing with the crisis at hand as a nation and why are we messing up. Before we move in, if you find value in my work, subscribe to the channel and share this video to as many people as possible. The question that you might have at this point is, how can a man-made disaster like the Chernobyl nuclear reactor blast be compared to a health crisis and a pandemic like COVID-19? What if I tell you that COVID-19 is also a man-made crisis that we have brought upon ourselves? No, I'm not talking about China and them giving the world the virus. Rather, I will go back to the famous German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who in his book Rich Society has told the world how a fate of endangerment has arisen in modernity, a sort of counter-modernity which transcends all our concepts of space, time, and social differentiation. What yesterday was still far away will be found today and in the future at the front door. To simplify this, let me take you back to how the pandemic actually spread its wings. It is believed to have started in the wet markets of China, where, as per the probing team of WHO, frozen food could be one reason for the origin of the virus. If climate change was the result of carbon emissions, the emergence of viruses such as HIV and the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 could be traced to the intrusion of humans into delicate forest ecosystems and the vast animal incubators of the agro-industrial complex, a concept that Beck points out as risks of modernity, where human needs and greed pushes us in directions less traveled. Now we all know the Chernobyl story. A badly designed reactor resulting in an explosion that rattled the world, as the Soviet government tirelessly worked to hide the unfolding disaster. Thousands of people remained unknowingly exposed to severe radiation. Countless died, although the official numbers reflected just over 30 deaths. If all of this sounds too familiar to you with the current COVID crisis that we are experiencing, then I'm afraid history is repeating itself all over again. But this time around, it's closer to home.
बहुत खतरनाक यंगस्टर ज़्यादा आ रहे हैं, पहले बुजुर्ग आए थे, नंबर 1। नंबर 2, अभी कम से कम 40-45 डेड बॉडी पर डे हम घरों से उठा रहे हैं क्वारंटाइन, जो कोरोना से मर रहे हैं और जो प्रशासनिक रिकॉर्ड में भी नहीं आते हैं। इसीलिए लोग कहते हैं कि यार कम तो दिखा रहे हैं, लोग तो ज़्यादा मर रहे हैं।
The Chernobyl disaster took place in the year 1986, which was later brought to life through the 2019 historical drama television miniseries, which talked about the massive cleanup undertaken by the Soviet government in the aftermath of the event to divert the blame. The 5-part miniseries went on to receive critical acclaim and audience appreciation, but most importantly, it opened up the debate around the tragedy all over again. For the first time, a series based on disaster looked at it from the people's perspective. The lesser-known stories of our everyday heroes, the firefighters, the doctors, nurses, volunteers and miners who were convinced to clear the massive radiation field debris, and countless civilians who were affected directly and indirectly by the event. Craig Mazin, the creator of the show, stated in a report that the lesson of Chernobyl isn't that modern nuclear power is dangerous. The lesson is that lying, arrogance, and suppression of criticism are dangerous. Something that is all too real for India currently. In the last couple of months, India has experienced almost everything that Mazin found lacking in the response post-Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Now I'll take you through 5 things that happened in Chernobyl which was portrayed beautifully in the series that we could have followed to avert the present crisis that India is going through today.
The real danger is that if we hear enough lies, then we no longer recognize the truth at all.
It reminds me of a lesson I learned in my childhood, that to cover one lie, one has to put another on top of it, and then another, and so on. But the thing about lies coming from people in power whom you trust or invest in is the high probability of it getting accepted. Lies were probably easier to hide from public eyes back in the time of Chernobyl, but in the current context, when you have things happening in front of your eyes every day on the social media platforms and the connectedness of the universe, the lie is always out there. In risk society, we become radically dependent on specialized scientific knowledge to define what is and what is not dangerous in advance of encountering the dangers themselves. We become, as Bex put it, small, private, alternative experts in risks of modernization. Thus, we take a crash course in epidemiology and educate ourselves about a deadly virus, its effects, its cure, and whatnot. The result? Lies multiply. Through WhatsApp forwards, companies trying to encash opportunities to boost immunity, instances of pseudoscience taking over actual science in all possible manner. And not just that, state after state witnessed governments playing an active role in hiding crucial facts from the masses. Rather than presenting the real picture of the catastrophe at play, the death numbers was hidden. Dissemination of key information through a centralized channel lacked, and the translucency in efforts to solve the problems was resulted in an unpleasant mess.
You are dealing with something that has never occurred on this planet before.
Chernobyl was a disaster which nobody was prepared for, although people within the system were not unaware of the risks. And so did India. The ailing healthcare system has been pointed out again and again all through these years. Governments after governments not only ignored the fact, but wasted the opportunity to make any amends, especially the whole year they got after the first wave plundered the country last year. The recent hue and cry for basic necessities like oxygen, hospital beds, ventilator is a reminder of the callous attitude shown in working on a problem at hand.
There has been an accident at Chernobyl, but I've been assured there is no problem.
I'm telling you that there is.
I prefer my opinion to yours.
At present, politics and science are at two ends of the spectrum. But there has never been a more dire need for them to go hand in hand, especially when a catastrophe of this nature is at play. Chernobyl shows us the effects of science and politics being at the loggerheads. While on one hand, the science wants to show, explain and eradicate the dangers, politics decides to hide, complicate and sweep it under the rug. Like it never happened.
भारत में सब चंगा सी.
When actually, it's far from the ground reality. When it comes to a health crisis, science should direct the elected leadership to a choice of paths that can help sail over it. India has lacked scientific temper in addressing the risk associated with the deadly virus, although it saw examples after examples in countries after countries falling to curb its spread. India decided to take its blinders on and move ahead, thinking that they are far ahead of the curve. When political leaders take science in their hands, the results are not going to be very helpful.
If the Americans had that kind of technology, do you really think they'd give it to us? And even if they would, the Central Committee would never stoop to ask.
Chernobyl shows how the government's arrogance to ask for help and the complex geopolitical relations act as hindrance when we look at solving a problem of a modern risk society. The world has always struggled to cooperate for a change, in this case to eradicate a disease. Take for example the constant fallout of the Paris Agreement or the many attempts to end global terrorism. Even during a pandemic, there were reports of the United States government withholding funding to WHO and reports of vaccine IPs being held back by big pharmaceutical corporations. On the other hand, India began its own vaccine diplomacy even before making sure its supplies met its own demands. Anticipating that the virus will die down on its own, it did not ask for help from developed nations in early stages to ramp up production. Instead, it continued supplying countries with lower production capacity with vaccine vials at a time when only 2% of the total population of India had been vaccinated completely. In the face of adversity, ego is not something that can help solve problems, can it? The result? The world is now looking at the inability of the government of the largest democracy to handle a crisis of this magnanimous scale, hence questioning their credibility and foresight.
Of course no one can blame me for this. How can I be responsible? I was sleeping.
Nobody wants to take responsibility for a disaster. Chernobyl shows that efficiently in its portrayal with the shifting blame game where the government couldn't have been questioned and thus naturally the blame had to be taken by the people working at the reactor. The people with lesser power who did not take policy decisions but follow orders were made scapegoats because nobody wants to take responsibility for a disaster. Right from the onset, this has been the attitude in the way we have managed our COVID response in India as well. Beck points out that the modern risks are so unexpected that you never know whom to blame for the things that might go wrong. Because when everyone is responsible, no one is. When politicians rally without wearing masks, people follow them. When things open up in our own states, we go partying after a hard day's work. When cases go down, we stop washing our hands or maintain distance. We become part of the problem and look for people to be held responsible. This is what Beck terms as organized irresponsibility. So how can we be responsible and collectively make sure that history does not repeat itself? Number one, we need to make sure that we neither fall for unscientific temper nor do we let others make the same mistake. If somebody forwards you a message that you know is fake, inform them. Aware people at your own level to help them understand what vaccination could help them achieve. Only through collective knowledge that we can eradicate this virus. Number two, enforce lawmakers to look beyond their own vested interests and focus on the basics like education, healthcare, and livelihood. Educate yourselves and others about the risks and the need to plan for it. Number three, look around you. You will realize the greens around you are disappearing, and although you might not be able to see the melting of the poles, it certainly is happening. The more we expose ourselves to the risks of global warming, the graver the situation will turn out to be. Act today. Start investing in a resilient future. Number four, a pandemic is a reminder of the demands you should make to your elected government. If more voices arise, governments are bound to listen. Don't let the dissenting voices stop and demand for accountability of your taxes. And lastly, empathize and work together. No crisis has ever been solved with just the government's efforts. Just like we brought the crisis through the acceptance of modern risks together, we have to come together as a collective whole to bounce back better. Chernobyl is a great example of how a crisis should not be handled. A blueprint to the governments across the world to understand the power of truth. But there is a little more to the Chernobyl story that the present government might not be looking into. When the truth of incompetence of the Soviet regime to handle the crisis came out, the regime paid the price. People lost faith both in leadership and legitimacy of the government. What followed was the great collapse of the Soviet Union.
Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?